Welcome back to Grim Histories, the channel where we delve into the darkest, weirdest, and most fascinating corners of the past. Today, we're venturing into the medieval world, a time of chivalry, castles, and catastrophic medical practices. Rats scurry through the streets carrying a silent, deadly passenger. Coffins are stacked high, overflowing from cemeteries. The screams of the dying echo through the cobbled streets. This wasn't a horror movie, this was reality. Well, let's just say it wasn't a pretty picture. Imagine the scene, a plague-ridden patient, covered in leeches, their bodies further weakened by the loss of blood. The stench alone must have been enough to induce vomiting. Yet this was considered cutting-edge medicine. These so-called cures didn't just fail to combat the plague. They actively weakened the immune systems of those already battling a deadly disease. The treatments meant to combat the Black Death, based on the deeply flawed theory of the four humors, likely contributed to its devastating death toll. This wasn't just incompetence. It was a tragic combination of misinformation, superstition, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the human body. They opened up fresh wounds for infection and spread disease among themselves. The very treatments intended to save lives likely hastened the deaths of countless individuals. The most common treatment? Bloodletting. Think of it. Already weakened by a deadly plague, people were routinely subjected to having their blood drained, often in copious amounts. These weren't your subtly flavored herbal teas. We're talking about concoctions that would make a modern chemist shudder. Think arsenic, mercury, crushed gemstones, all thrown together in a bubbling cauldron, often with ingredients chosen based on bizarre astrological alignments or superstitious beliefs. This wasn't done with sterile needles either. We're talking rusty lancets, crude tools that often introduced further infection. We've only just scratched the surface of the bizarre and often deadly practices employed during this horrific period. The logic? If you have too much blood, remove some. It sounds utterly insane, right? And it was. The Black Death, the bubonic plague, was decimating Europe. It is estimated that between 30% and 60% of Europe's population perished, a staggering number that makes the mind reel. Specifically, we're tackling the Black Death, a plague so horrific it wiped out a third of Europe's population. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single gruesome detail. Imagine, if you will, the year 1347. The stench of death hangs heavy in the air. But here's the chilling question. Did medieval medicine help, or did it actually make the Black Death worse? Was it a cure worse than the disease itself? Forget the heroic doctors of modern medicine. In the Middle Ages, medical knowledge was, let's just say, limited. Forget germ theory. The prevailing medical model was rooted in the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this theory, illness was a result of an imbalance in these humors. The answer, my friends, is far more complicated and far more disturbing than you might think. So how did they rebalance these humors? But bloodletting wasn't the only bizarre remedy. Leeches, those slimy, blood-sucking creatures, were considered a miracle cure. And if leeches weren't enough, there were always potions. The absurdity is almost comical if it weren't for the devastating consequences. Can you believe it? This is just the beginning of our journey into the grim world of medieval medicine and the Black Death. So, we've established that the Black Death was a horrific catastrophe, wiping out a significant portion of Europe's population. But what did they do about it? Well, buckle up, buttercups, because the answer is surprisingly, terrifyingly, and hilariously wrong. We've talked about the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, the medieval belief that these fluids dictated health. Imbalanced humors? Disease, the solution? Rebalance those fluids naturally. The air hangs thick with the smell of herbs, sweat, and, well, blood. Our patient, pale and gasping, lies on a rough-hewn table. The physician, often a barber surgeon, yes, a barber. I know what you're thinking. Surely somebody knew better? Well, some individuals did voice concerns, but their arguments were often drowned out by the prevailing medical beliefs of the time. The church, too, played a significant role. Prayers, pilgrimages, and religious processions were common responses to the plague. often overshadowing any attempts at rational medical intervention. The lack of understanding about disease transmission meant that even well-intentioned efforts often backfired spectacularly. So the combination of bloodletting, leeches, dubious potions, and a hefty dose of religious fervor created a deadly cocktail that, unfortunately, often proved worse than the disease itself. This was a time when the line between healer and harm-doer was frequently blurred. And this, my friends, is just the beginning of our exploration into the grim realities of medieval medicine and the Black Death. Wields a lancet, a small, pointed blade, with a grim determination that would make a modern surgeon shudder. A swift, decisive jab, and the lifeblood begins to flow. And how, pray tell, did one rebalance the humors in the 14th century? Perhaps they did have some rudimentary understanding of pulse and blood pressure, but their interpretation was, let's just say, imaginative. The goal wasn't necessarily to remove a specific amount of blood. It was to drain enough to rebalance the humors. How much is enough? Well, that was largely up to the barber surgeon's intuition, or perhaps their mood that day. Let's just say it involved a lot of blood. Lots and lots of blood, feeling a bit off, bloodletting. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of popping a couple of ibuprofen, except instead of popping a pill, they were popping veins. Bloodletting, my friends, was the go-to treatment for practically everything. Fever, bloodletting. Plague, bloodletting. Imagine the scene, a dimly lit room, perhaps in a crumbling manor house or a bustling city dwelling. Now, you might be thinking, surely they had some method? These slimy, blood-sucking creatures were considered a miraculous cure-all. Think of them as medieval medical superheroes, only instead of saving the day, they were often hastening the end. Leeches were applied to various parts of the body, left to gorge themselves on blood, and then, well, that's about it. The hope was that the leech would somehow magically draw out the disease along with the blood. One particularly gruesome example comes from the writings of Guy de Chauliac, a prominent surgeon of the time. He recommended applying leeches to the groin, a choice area, I'm sure you'll agree, to treat bubonic plague. Can you imagine? Already weakened by the plague, these poor souls were then subjected to the added indignity of having leeches attached to their most delicate regions. And let's not forget the potions. Oh, the potions. The recipes for these concoctions varied wildly, ranging from the mildly unpleasant to the outright toxic. We're talking about mixtures of herbs, minerals, animal parts, even human remains in some particularly grim cases. The logic was that these concoctions would either purify the blood, strengthen the body, or somehow magically ward off the plague. The reality? Many of these potions were more likely to poison the patient than cure them. But bloodletting wasn't the only bizarre practice. Enter the leech. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely somebody knew better? Well, some individuals did voice concerns, but their arguments were often drowned out by the prevailing medical beliefs of the time. You wouldn't believe what people did to try and cure the plague. The church, too, played a significant role. Prayers, pilgrimages, and religious processions were common responses to the plague, and often these took priority over any attempt at rational medical intervention. For example, in one Italian village, the priest sprinkled holy water on the houses and then everyone got really sick. Because the people didn't understand how disease was spread, they thought that the plague was God's punishment for their sins. So they did terrible things in the name of God. So let's just say that the combination of bloodletting, leeches, dubious potions, and a hefty dose of religious fervor did not make for a very effective treatment plan. And unfortunately, often it was the treatment that killed them. This was a time when the line between healer and harm-doer was frequently blurred. And this, my friends, is just the beginning of our exploration into the grim realities of medieval medicine and the Black Death. So we've talked about bloodletting, leeches, and the frankly terrifying logic behind medieval medical practices. But let's talk about something even more visually striking. Something that has become almost iconic in our modern understanding of the Black Death, the plague doctor. The reality, however, was far more complex and possibly far more sinister. The plague doctor's costume, far from being a symbol of protection, may have actually played a part in spreading the very disease it was supposed to prevent. That long, bird-like beak, the dark, hooded robe. It's instantly recognizable, a symbol of both dread and a bygone era of medical ignorance. In a time of widespread panic and superstition, the plague doctor became a figure both revered and feared, a harbinger of death and, paradoxically, a source of hope, however misguided that hope may have been. His writings detail his experiences treating plague victims, and while he advocates for certain sanitary practices, the overall approach still reflects the limitations of the time. It serves as a stark reminder of the limitations of medieval medicine and the devastating consequences of misinformation and superstition in the face of a catastrophic event. The costume, meant to protect, became a macabre symbol of a time when even the best intentions could pave the road to hell, or at least a significantly higher death toll. His descriptions of the plague doctor's clothing and procedures reinforce the image of a figure both mysterious and potentially dangerous. Their presence could have unwittingly stoked fear, potentially worsening the psychological impact of the plague on the already terrified population. But what was the real story behind this infamous costume? Was it a beacon of hope, or something else entirely? The image conjured in our minds, often romanticized in fiction, is usually that of a selfless healer, braving the pestilence to tend to the sick. Think about it, that distinctive beak. Far from being a purely decorative element, it was believed to contain fragrant herbs and other substances intended to filter out the miasma, the foul-smelling air that was thought to be the cause of the plague. Can you imagine? The very air itself deemed the culprit, and this elaborate mask was meant to purify it. The herbs, however, were often ineffective, and the close proximity to infected individuals, even with the beak, was a significant risk factor. We now know, of course, that the bubonic plague was spread by fleas carried by rats, not by bad smells. The waxed leather clothing, another key feature of the costume, was meant to prevent the plague from penetrating the doctor's body. But the problem here is that these suits were often reused without proper sterilization, a concept completely alien to the medieval mindset. Imagine the accumulation of bacteria and pathogens from one patient to the next, trapped within the folds of that heavy, almost impenetrable clothing. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? The very tools intended to protect potentially became vectors for the deadly disease. But it gets even stranger. The design of the costume itself, with its concealing hood and overall darkness, created an aura of mystery and fear. Consider Charles Delorme, a physician in 17th century France, well after the peak of the Black Death, but still a time when plague doctors were a common sight. The plague doctor's costume, then, is a fascinating example of how good intentions, coupled with a lack of scientific understanding, could actually contribute to the very problem they were trying to solve. It serves as a stark reminder of the limitations of medieval medicine and the devastating consequences of misinformation and superstition in the face of a catastrophic event. The costume, meant to protect, became a macabre symbol of a time when even the best intentions could pave the road to hell, or at least a significantly higher death toll. So we've looked at the bizarre and often lethal cures peddled by medieval physicians. But let us be clear, bad medicine alone didn't wipe out a third of Europe's population. The Black Death was a perfect storm, a confluence of factors that turned a deadly disease into an apocalyptic nightmare. And a significant part of that storm was brewed by society itself. While he might have been ahead of his time in some respects, he couldn't escape the prevailing societal currents. His writings show a man wrestling with the complexities of the plague, trying to understand its transmission, but ultimately hampered by the pervasive superstitions and prejudices of his time. His attempts to rationally explain the plague were often overshadowed by the widespread acceptance of supernatural explanations and the consequent persecution of innocent individuals. The sheer scale of death and suffering was staggering. Mass graves overflowed, churches became charnel houses, and entire villages were wiped out. The social fabric of Europe was torn apart. The economic consequences were devastating too, shattering established trade routes and plunging many regions into prolonged periods of poverty and instability. So, while the bizarre medical practices of the time undoubtedly contributed to the death toll, it's crucial to understand that the Black Death wasn't simply a medical failure. It was a societal catastrophe, a stark demonstration of how fear, ignorance, and social structures can amplify a tragedy, turning a deadly disease into a devastating plague of unimaginable proportions. It wasn't just bad medicine. It was bad governance, bad societal responses, and a terrifying convergence of factors that created the perfect storm. Can you believe it? The very attempts to fight the plague often made it worse. Think about it. Imagine a densely packed medieval city, London, Paris, Florence. Picture narrow, twisting streets choked with refuse, overflowing cesspits, a constant source of stench and disease. These weren't just unsanitary. They were breeding grounds for infection. Rats, teeming with fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, had free rein. The very structure of medieval society, with its cramped living conditions and limited understanding of hygiene, actively fostered the spread of the plague. Then there's the matter of religious fervor, often twisted into frightening extremes. Remember those flagellant processions we touched upon earlier? Thousands upon thousands of people, their bodies raw from self-inflicted wounds, parading through the streets, believing their penance would appease God and stop the plague. The reality? They were creating the perfect environment for the plague to spread even faster. Open wounds, close proximity, shared bodily fluids. It was a gruesome recipe for disaster, but the grim reality extended beyond self-flagellation. Desperation breeds scapegoats, and the Black Death was no exception. Jews, already marginalized and persecuted, were often blamed for the plague, accused of poisoning wells and spreading the disease. This led to horrific pogroms across Europe and massacres fueled by fear, ignorance, and religious prejudice. Instead of uniting against a common enemy, communities turned on each other, further weakening their collective ability to combat the plague. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were widespread events, leaving a trail of bloodshed and suffering in their wake. Remember the story of Arnaud de Villeneuve, a respected physician in the 13th century? While he might have been ahead of his time in some respects, he couldn't escape the prevailing societal currents. His writings show a man wrestling with the complexities of the plague, trying to understand its transmission, but ultimately hampered by the pervasive superstitions and prejudices of his time. His attempts to rationally explain the plague were often overshadowed by the widespread acceptance of supernatural explanations and the consequent persecution of innocent individuals. The sheer scale of death and suffering was staggering. Mass graves overflowed, churches became charnel houses, and entire villages were wiped out. The social fabric of Europe was torn apart. The economic consequences were devastating too, shattering established trade routes and plunging many regions into prolonged periods of poverty and instability. So, while the bizarre medical practices of the time undoubtedly contributed to the death toll, it's crucial to understand that the Black Death wasn't simply a medical failure. It was a societal catastrophe, a stark demonstration of how fear, ignorance, and social structures can amplify a tragedy, turning a deadly disease into a devastating plague of unimaginable proportions. It wasn't just bad medicine. It was bad governance, bad societal responses, and a terrifying convergence of factors that created the perfect storm. So, the Black Death swept through Europe, leaving a trail of death and despair that's almost impossible to fully comprehend. Millions perished, entire villages were wiped out. The very fabric of society seemed to unravel. Think of it as a morbid, twisted catalyst for progress. We've explored the bizarre, often horrific, attempts at treatment, the leeches, the bloodletting, the bizarre concoctions. Before the Black Death, the concept of hygiene as we understand it today was practically non-existent in many parts of Europe. Waste disposal was haphazard at best, and overcrowding in cities was rampant. While it would take centuries for the scientific revolution to fully overthrow the Galenic medical model, the utter failure of traditional methods to combat the plague opened the door to skepticism. The sheer scale of death, despite the best efforts of the most learned physicians, forced some to question the established medical dogma. This doesn't mean that a new scientific approach was immediately adopted, far from it. However, the seeds of doubt were sown, paving the way for future generations of thinkers to challenge the established medical paradigm and seek alternative explanations for disease. The Black Death, then, inadvertently became a grim harbinger of the scientific revolution. The sheer scale of death, however, made the horrifying consequences of these conditions impossible to ignore. The legacy of the Black Death is not simply one of death and suffering. It's a complex tapestry woven with threads of suffering, resilience, and yes, even unintended advancement. It's a reminder that even from the darkest chapters of history, unexpected consequences can emerge, shaping the future in ways we might never have imagined. The stench of death permeated the air, and the rotting corpses themselves became a terrifying breeding ground for disease. We've seen how societal responses, from religious flagellation to scapegoating, only worsened the catastrophe. But did this unimaginable horror leave absolutely nothing positive in its wake? Surprisingly, the answer is a complex and somewhat unsettling yes. The Black Death, in its grim and terrible way, inadvertently forced changes that, in the long run, contributed to advancements in several key areas. First, and perhaps most significantly, the plague spurred improvements in sanitation, albeit slowly and often reluctantly. While not a conscious, planned effort, the sheer scale of the crisis forced some communities to confront the link between filth and disease, a connection that would later be formalized by scientists like Girolamo Fracastoro. We see a gradual, albeit imperfect, improvement in waste management systems, the construction of better drainage systems in some cities, and a slow, hesitant move towards a greater awareness of hygiene. It wasn't a rapid revolution, but a seed was planted, a seed watered by the tears and blood of millions. Secondly, the plague inadvertently impacted urban planning. The devastation caused by the Black Death led to a reassessment of how cities were designed and managed. Overcrowding was identified as a major factor in the plague's spread, and while complete solutions remained elusive, there was a noticeable shift towards more regulated urban development in some areas. New building codes, though often poorly enforced, started to emerge, aiming to improve ventilation and reduce overcrowding. This was a tentative step towards creating healthier urban environments, a stark contrast to the fetid, disease-ridden towns of the pre-plague era. Finally, and perhaps most ironically, the Black Death subtly chipped away at the unshakable authority of the humorism theory. It's a dark, twisted irony, a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions, responsible for the deaths of millions, inadvertently contributing to societal and medical progress. The legacy of the Black Death is not simply one of death and suffering. It's a complex tapestry woven with threads of suffering, resilience, and yes, even unintended advancement. It's a reminder that even from the darkest chapters of history, unexpected consequences can emerge, shaping the future in ways we might never have imagined. So, there we have it, the bizarre tale of the singing potatoes, the spontaneously combusting monk, and the taxidermied badger that allegedly predicted the stock market crash of '29. Let's be honest. We've journeyed through some seriously strange historical footnotes. From the inexplicable potato-based serenades to the frankly unsettling self-immolation, the absurdity of it all is almost overwhelming, and who could forget the prophetic badger? A truly unsettling blend of the uncanny and the utterly ridiculous. But beyond the laughs and the gasps, what can we take away from this peculiar historical tapestry? The lesson, perhaps, lies in the sheer multiplicity of narratives. And what does it tell us about the way we construct and understand our past? History isn't a neatly packaged collection of facts. It's a chaotic jumble of perspectives, interpretations, and sometimes outright oddities. And subscribe to this channel to ensure you don't miss out on future explorations of the hidden and the unusual. What one generation dismisses as folklore, another might embrace as profound truth. By exploring these seemingly insignificant, even absurd, corners of the past, we gain a richer, more nuanced understanding of the human experience, its capacity for both the extraordinary and the utterly inexplicable. We learn to question the accepted narrative and to seek out the untold stories that lie hidden in the margins. This brings us to a question for you. What seemingly insignificant historical event, story, or anecdote has captivated your imagination? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Like this video if you found this journey into the strange corners of history compelling, and subscribe to this channel to ensure you don't miss out on future explorations of the hidden and the unusual.